Hello and welcome back to my channel. Thank you guys very much for tuning in. And for all you guys that checked out my last video, thanks a lot. I really greatly appreciate that. I wasn't expecting to get that many views on my first video, so I really greatly appreciate that. Now, if you're new here and you haven't seen that video, I do recommend that you go watch that. It's going to give you a brief, 7-minute overview detailing what sort of material we're going to be covering on this channel. But without further ado, we're just going to dive right into this. Now, if you're a man watching this, there is a good chance that you've started to wonder at some point in the past couple of years what exactly is going on with women in this country and why have they changed so dramatically in the past 10 years or so. Why do they seem to be so bent upon wanting to be the new men of society? Why have their behaviors, their attitudes, and their temperaments changed so dramatically? And why is our society seemingly hell-bent upon propping women up into leadership roles all the way across the board simply because they are women? Why is our society moving away from a male-centric culture, a culture that has existed for thousands of years, and moving towards a female-centric culture? And not just a female-centric culture, but a culture centered around women who are emulating and appropriating masculinity. Well, in order to understand how this situation has evolved, it's going to take us probably many videos, but I guess a good place to start is to take a look at who women are in the 21st century and to take a look at their social ecology in the 21st century. Now, it's no big secret that women are adept communicators and socializers, but what a lot of men out there may not realize is that women kind of have their own private culture going on. And this is something that's readily observable in today's world, but it hasn't always been that way, even though they've always kind of had their own culture. And women are partial to things like self-segregation on their own terms, which is just a fancy way of saying that they like to create and cultivate private spaces for women, for themselves. And for a lot of women, when they inhabit such spaces, they become completely different people than they are when they're in front of men. And women have a real penchant for private communication among themselves, which, if you're a guy out there, I'm sure you've seen examples of this, whether you realized it or not. Maybe you've been at a dinner before, a large dinner function, and you've seen 2 or more women leave to go to the bathroom together. Well, believe it or not, they're actually not going in there to hold hands while they take a dump, although that was my first suspicion. But they're usually going in there to talk about somebody at the table or to talk about something that they don't want somebody at the table to overhear. Now, and women have always kind of been this way too. They've always kind of had a penchant for things like gossiping in private and cultivating private spaces to gossip and to, just be women, I guess. And this penchant for private communication in private spaces in the digital age has translated to a widespread proliferation of private digital spaces for women. Things like Facebook groups and group chats and even chain messages. All of these things, for as long as social media has been a normalized part of American society, have been part of the digital scene. And women have had these spaces since Facebook has been popular. And from what I can gather, for the most part, these spaces were relatively benign. They were spaces devoted to things like gossiping or talking about relationships or even talking about their sex life. But around the turn of the 2010s, things started to kind of take a weird turn. One day in October of 2011, as men were scrolling their news feeds on social media platforms like Facebook, they were greeted with a series of bizarre posts, all of which were of a very similar nature. Posts that read things like, "I like it on the table," or "I like it on the mantle." And they would just keep scrolling and they would see another post and it would say, "I like it on the dresser." And then they would scroll some more and find another one. "I like it on the hood of the car." And they kept scrolling and they were seeing more and more posts like that. And they started to notice it was only women who were making those posts. And it seemed to be every woman who was on social media that day who was making those posts. So men started asking questions and started to get a little bit puzzled by what was going on. And they started asking women, what are these posts about? Why are all of you guys posting status updates saying where you like it, whatever that's supposed to mean? And to their utter dismay, women would not answer their questions. And no matter how hard men prodded for that entire day, women would not answer the questions, and they maintained the line of secrecy for the whole day. Finally, at the end of the day, it seems that women in unison all took to social media at the same time to announce their intentions to men. And they said, this was all a joke. This is actually an initiative for Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And these posts that we made were describing where we like to keep our purse. I like to keep mine on the mantle. I like to keep mine on a dresser, whatever. And men, for their part, readily accepted this explanation and never really thought about it again after that. They certainly never pondered the deeper implications of the event itself, such as the fact that women had very obviously coordinated a large scale initiative in private and then kept the entire thing a secret for an entire day. But that was that, and it was swept into the dustbin of history, and men never really noticed anything strange like that again until the year 2015. But before we dive any deeper into what happened in 2015, we need to take a closer look at the female social ecology. Now, we've already covered that women kind of have a penchant for private communication and just privacy in general, and that women kind of have their own private culture going on, an exclusive female only culture. But this culture that women have and this penchant for privacy can be weaponized into a full blown penchant for secrecy under the right conditions. And I'm going to try to explain how this process comes about. Now, a lot of you men out there have probably recognized by now that most women are extremely adverse to things like being shamed and being ridiculed or being embarrassed. And for a lot of women in today's world, they really kind of have some profound accountability issues. Well, there's a specific set of reasons why this is the way that it is, and it has a lot to do with where women are situated in the human hierarchy in relation to men. You see, men are the bigger fish in the sea, and men, traditionally, in order to survive, have had to go out into the world and take what they want. That's how men survive. They go out in the world and they take what they want. And men are overt creatures. But by comparison, women, traditionally, in order to survive, have had to rely upon men to give them what they want. And much of the female temperament is actually built around this dynamic, where men have had to go out into the world and figure out better ways to get what they want. Women have had to figure out better ways to get men to give them what they want. And they've had to figure out how to utilize their charm to entice men to give them what they want. And because of where women are situated in relation to men, there's a certain level of fear that they carry with them. It's related to being the smaller fish in the sea, but it's also somewhat related to their reputations. You see, a woman's reputation to a woman is a lot more important than a man's reputation is to a man, which is not to say that a man's reputation isn't important, because it absolutely is. But if a woman is despised in the eyes of men, it can profoundly affect her ability to survive, at least from a biological standpoint. And women carry a certain fear with them over their reputations being tarnished. And this is the real reason why you see so many women with such accountability issues. That's why even when you tell them, hey, it's okay, you can admit what you did, they're just like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm not trying to stereotype women when I say that, but I'm sure a lot of you watching this video know exactly what I'm talking about. But this fear doesn't just operate on a singular level and on an individual level, it also operates on a group level. And women have a tendency to try to cover up and conceal things that make women as a whole look bad because they fear their reputations being tarnished. They fear the impact that the exposure of such a thing can have upon all women. And I think a good example that everybody can relate to is the fairly recent Amber Heard case. You know, her foul behavior was on display for every eye to see, and yet there were still a few women on social media who were trying to downplay it and were like, well, what about Johnny? What about his alleged abuse? And the reason they do stuff like that is because in Amber's case, she was caught doing something that just didn't reflect very good on women as a whole, and it kind of kicked in that fear. But where this culture of secrecy comes into play, When you take an entire group of women or an entire generation of women and you involve them in something that makes women as a whole look bad if they were to get caught, suddenly you have women keeping a secret more fiercely than members of the mafia do. And, for all the gossiping they do, women are very good at keeping certain things a secret, and that's why. But another component of the female temperament we need to take a look at is the fact that women are also very good at manipulating men, and women's aptitude in this area stems from where they're situated in the human hierarchy in relation to men. Because women are wired to rely upon men to give them what they want, women have the skill of steering men around, and they're able to steer men around in ways that men are not able to steer women around. And a woman is very good at reading a man and sniffing out his flaws, his ignorances, his weaknesses, and using all of those things to her advantage to manipulate him. A woman is good at sniffing out the plausible deniability available to them in any given situation and using that to their advantage. And that usually comes into play like if their reputation's in jeopardy, then they'll sniff out any plausible deniability available to them and will use that to misdirect men. And they're really good at misdirecting men. And what all of this amounts to, I call it feminine soft power. And it's really a very mighty thing. It's feminine soft power has destroyed some of the strongest men in history, including Samson, who was the strongest man in history. And I think women's soft power was God's way of leveling the playing field for women because of where women are situated in the human hierarchy, and because they're not the head of their homes or the head of society, although they think they are in today's world. God gave them tools to deal with men, special tools to deal with men, and it was God's way of giving women some of the power back. But it begs the question, if we're in today's world, if we're propping women up into leadership roles and are giving them traditional male authority and hard power, and they have that in addition to their pre-existing feminine soft power, what does that amount to exactly? Well, if you can answer that, you're well on your way to understanding why organizations like the United Nations are so keen on propping women up into leadership roles globally in the first place. Now, we'll resume our original narrative. The year was 2015, and there was a great abundance of private online spaces available to women. And suddenly, a very curious thing began to happen in these spaces. There was a bombardment of ideologies that began to circulate within these spaces. And for a lot of women, especially women living in places like the rural South and the American Midwest, and really outside of a university setting, a lot of women had never been exposed to these ideologies. These were ideologies like feminist theory and critical race theory and even queer theory. And after a short time of being exposed to these ideologies, women's conception and their perceptions of the world and of their own identity and of men's identity and their relationship to men began to change dramatically. And women at this point began their transformation process into the people who they are today. But this bombardment of ideologies is not the only thing that began to make their rounds within women's private spaces. There were also certain proposals and certain calls to action. Now, what were these calls to action and what did they entail? That's what we're going to discuss in the next video. Until then, thank you all for tuning in. See you next time.